peasant-serf risings, bourgeois revolutions. Fall of the feudal system. The struggle of the peasantry against the feudal landowners took place throughout the whole feudal epoch, but it became particularly sharp towards the end of this epoch. In the 14th century, France was in the grip of a peasant war which has gone down to history as the Jacquerie. The rising bourgeoisie of the towns at first supported this movement, but left it at the decisive moment. At the end of the 14th century in England, a peasant revolt flared up which covered the greater part of the country. Armed peasants headed by Wat Tyler went through the country, sacking landlords' estates and the monasteries, and entered London. The feudal lords turned to violence and deceit in order to suppress the rising. Tyler was treacherously killed. Believing the promises of the king and the feudal lords, the rebels dispersed to their homes. After this, punitive expeditions went about the countryside dealing out savage punishment to the peasants. At the beginning of the 16th century, Germany was convulsed by a peasant war supported by the town poor. Thomas Munzer was the leader of the rebels. The peasants demanded the abolition of the license and violence of the gentry. In Russia, the peasant wars headed by Stepan Razin in the 17th century and Emelian Pugachev in the 18th century were on a particularly large scale. The rebellious peasants sought the abolition of serfdom, the transfer to themselves of the landowners and government lands, and the ending of landlord rule. The intensification of the crisis of the feudal serf-owning system of economy in the 1850s was expressed in a broad wave of peasant risings on the eve of the 1861 reform. In China, peasant wars and risings on a huge scale took place throughout the centuries. The rising of the Taiping in the period of the Qing dynasty, middle of the 19th century, embraced the millions of the peasantry. The rebels occupied the ancient capital of China, Nanking. The Taiping agrarian law proclaimed equality in the use of land and other property. In state organization, the Taiping linked monarchy and peasant democracy in their own way, which is also characteristic of peasant movements in other countries. The revolutionary significance of peasant risings was that they shook the foundations of feudalism and in the end led to the abolition of serfdom. The transition from feudalism to capitalism in the countries of Western Europe took place through bourgeois revolutions. The struggle of the peasants against the landowners was used by the rising bourgeoisie in order to hasten the downfall of the feudal system, to replace serf exploitation by capitalist exploitation and take power into their own hands. The peasants formed the basic mass of those fighting against feudalism in the bourgeois revolutions. So it was in the first bourgeois revolution in the Netherlands in the 16th century. So it was in the English Revolution of the 17th century. So it was in the bourgeois revolution in France at the end of the 18th century. The bourgeoisie used the fruits of the revolutionary struggle of the peasantry, climbing to power on its shoulders. The peasants were strong in their hatred of the oppressors. The peasant risings, however, bore a spontaneous character. The peasantry, as a class of small private owners, was split up and could not create a clear program or a strong and well-knit organization for the struggle. Peasant risings can lead to success only if they unite with the workers' movement and if the workers lead the peasant risings. At the period of the bourgeois revolutions of the 17th and 18th centuries, however, the working class was still weak, few in numbers and unorganized. In the womb of feudal society, more or less complete forms of the capitalist order ripened. The new exploiting class, the capitalist class, grew up and there appeared at the same time masses of people deprived of the means of production, the proletarians. In the period of bourgeois revolutions, the bourgeoisie used against feudalism the economic law of the obligatory correspondence between relations of production and the character of the forces of production. They overthrew feudal production relations, created new, bourgeois production relations and brought production relations into keeping with the character of the forces of production which had ripened in the womb of feudalism. The bourgeois revolutions put an end to the feudal system and established the dominance of capitalism. Economic views of the feudal period, the social system dominant at that time was reflected in the economic views of the feudal period. Mental life in feudal society was under the control of the clergy and therefore found expression predominantly in a religious and scholastic form. Considerations on the economic life of that time formed special sections in theological tracts. Economic opinions in China were for many centuries under the influence of the teaching of Confucius. Confucianism as a religious ideology had arisen already in the 5th century BC. The social and economic views of Confucianism require strict maintenance of the hierarchy of feudal estates, both in state structure and in family life. In Confucius's words, the unenlightened people should obey the aristocrats and wise men. Disobedience by ordinary people to their superiors is the beginning of disorder. At the same time, Confucius called upon the nobles to be humane and not to treat the poor too harshly. Confucius advocated the necessity of uniting China, which was then divided under the rule of a monarch. Confucius and his followers idealized backward forms of economy and extolled the golden age of the patriarchal past. The peasantry, crushed by the feudal aristocracy and the merchants, put into the Confucian preachings their own aspirations and hopes for betterment of their lot, though Confucianism did not express the class interests of the peasantry. As it developed, Confucianism became transformed into the official ideology of the feudal nobility. It was used by the ruling classes for the purpose of training the people in a spirit of slavish submission to the feudalists and of perpetuating the feudal system. One of the ideologists of feudalism in medieval Europe, Thomas Aquinas, 13th century, attempted to justify the need for feudal society by divine law, proclaiming feudal property as necessary and reasonable, and declaring the peasant serfs to be slaves. Thomas Aquinas, in opposition to the ancient slave owners, asserted that in his soul the slave is free, and therefore a master has no right to kill a slave. Labor was no longer considered unworthy of a free man. Thomas Aquinas regarded physical labor as base and mental labor as noble. In this division he saw the justification for society's division into estates. The same approach from the point of view of the feudal estates appeared in his views on wealth. Each person should own wealth in keeping with the position which he occupied on the hierarchical feudal ladder. From this point of view, the teaching of the medieval theologians on the so-called just price is characteristic. The just price should reflect the quantity of labor expended in producing a commodity and the estate of the producer. Medieval defenders of the just price did not protest at all against merchant profits. They only strove to confine profits within bounds so that they would not threaten the economic existence of the other estates. They condemned usury as a low and immoral occupation. With the development of commodity production and exchange, however, the clergy themselves began to take part in money lending. Along with this, the attitude of the church to usury became more and more tolerant. The class struggle of the oppressed and exploited masses against the ruling classes of feudal society developed in a religious form for several centuries. The demands of exploited peasants and journeymen were frequently based on quotations from the Bible. All sorts of sects were very widespread. The Catholic Church, fiercely persecuting heretics through the Inquisition, burned them at the stake. With the development of the class struggle, the religious form of the movement of the oppressed masses retreated into the background, and the revolutionary character of this movement stood out ever more clearly. The peasants demanded the suppression of serf slavery, the abolition of feudal privileges, the establishment of equal rights, the abolition of estates, and so on. In the course of the peasant wars in England, Bohemia, and Germany, the slogans of the rebels became more and more radical. The longing of the exploited masses of town and country for equality expressed itself in the demand for community of property. This was a yearning for equality in the sphere of consumption. Although the demand for community of property was unrealizable, it was of revolutionary significance at that time since it rallied the masses in struggle against feudal oppression. Towards the end of the feudal period, two outstanding early utopian socialists appeared: the Englishman Thomas More, who wrote Utopia, 16th century, and the Italian Tommaso Campanella, whose book is called City of the Sun, 17th century. Seeing the growing inequality and contradictions of contemporary society, these thinkers expounded their views on the causes of social evils in an original form. They described what were, in their opinion, ideal social systems from which these evils would be excluded. In the books of these utopians, a social system is described which is free from private property and all its accompanying faults. Everyone in this society is engaged in both handicraft and agricultural labor. All inhabitants work 6 or even 4 hours a day, and the fruits of their labor are entirely sufficient to satisfy all their needs. Products are distributed according to need. The education of children is a concern of society. The works of More and Campanella played a progressive part in the process of the development of social thought. They contained ideas considerably in advance of the development of society of that time. More and Campanella, however, did not know the laws of social development, and their ideas were unrealizable, utopian. It was impossible at that time to destroy social inequality. The level of productive forces demanded the advance from feudal to capitalist exploitation. The rise of capitalism belongs to the 16th century. To the same century belong the first attempts to comprehend and explain a number of the phenomena of capitalism. Thus, in the 16th to 18th centuries there arose and developed the trend of economic thought and policy known as mercantilism. Mercantilism arose in England, and afterwards it appeared in France, Italy, and other countries. The mercantilists discussed the question of the country's wealth, the forms of wealth, and the ways of its growth. This was a time when capital in the form of merchant and usurer's capital was predominant in the sphere of trade and credit. In the sphere of production, however, it had made only the first steps by founding manufactories. After the discovery and conquest of America, a flood of gold and silver poured into Europe. Gold and silver were then ceaselessly redistributed among the individual European states, both by means of wars and through foreign trade. In their understanding of the nature of wealth, the mercantilists started from the superficial phenomena of circulation. They concentrated attention not on production, but on trade and money circulation, particularly the movement of gold and silver. In the view of the mercantilists, not social production and its products, but money, gold, and silver was the sole real wealth. The mercantilists demanded active intervention in economic life by the state, so that as much money as possible should flow into the country and as little as possible pass beyond its limits. The early mercantilists sought to achieve this by purely administrative measures, forbidding the export of money from the country. Later mercantilists considered it essential to expand foreign trade for these ends. Thus, an English partisan of mercantilism, Thomas Munn, 1571–1641, a great merchant and director of the East India Company, wrote, "The ordinary means, therefore, to increase our wealth and treasure is by foreign trade, wherein we must ever observe this rule, to sell more to strangers yearly than we consume of theirs in value." The mercantilists reflected the interests of the bourgeoisie, which was growing up in the womb of feudalism and striving to accumulate wealth in gold and silver by developing foreign trade, colonial plunder and trade wars, and the enslavement of backward peoples. In connection with the development of capitalism, they began to demand that the state authorities should protect the development of industrial enterprises, the manufactories. Export bounties, which were paid to merchants selling commodities on the foreign market, were established. Import duties soon became still more significant. With the development of the manufactories and later of factories, the imposition of duties on imported commodities became the most widespread defense measure of home industry against foreign competition. Such a defensive policy is called protectionism. In many countries it remained for a long time after the conceptions of mercantilism had been overcome. In England, protective duties were of great significance in the 16th and 17th centuries, when competition from the more developed manufactories of the Netherlands threatened her. From the 18th century, England was steadily gaining industrial leadership. Other less developed countries could not compete with her. Consequently, ideas of free trade began to gain ground in England. A different situation was created in countries which entered on the capitalist road later than England. Thus, in France in the 17th century, Colbert, the minister of Louis XIV, who in fact ruled the country, created a widely ramified system of state patronage of manufactories. His system included high import duties, the prohibition of exports of raw materials, the introduction of a number of new branches of industry, the setting up of companies for foreign trade, and so on. Mercantilism played a progressive part for its time. The protectionist policy inspired by the ideas of mercantilism greatly helped the spread of manufactories. The lack of development of capitalist production at that time, however, was reflected in the mercantilists' views of wealth. The further development of capitalism made the unsoundness of the conceptions of the mercantile system more and more evident. In Russia, in the 17th and 18th centuries, the feudal serf-owning system of economy was dominant. The economy was basically a natural one. At the same time, trade and handicraft developed considerably. A national market was formed and manufactories began to arise. These economic changes in the country helped to strengthen absolutism in Russia. The representatives of Russian economic thought, reflecting the historical and economic peculiarities of the country, developed certain mercantilist ideas. However, as distinct from many West European mercantilists, they ascribed great significance not only to trade, but also to the development of industry and agriculture. The economic views of that time were reflected in the works and measures of the 17th-century Russian statesman A.L. Ordonashchikin, in the economic policy of Peter I, and in the works of the most important Russian economist of the beginning of the 18th century, I.T. Pazashkov. In his book on Poverty and Wealth, 1724, I.T. Pazashkov expounded a broad program of Russian economic development and offered a developed justification for this program. Pazashkov demonstrated the necessity of adopting a number of economic measures in Russia with the aim of protecting the development of home industry, trade, and agriculture, and improving the country's financial system. In the last third of the 18th century, a tendency to the breakdown of feudal serf-owning relations was noticeable in Russia. This became much more acute in the first quarter of the 19th century, and later grew into a direct crisis of serfdom. The initiator of the revolutionary democratic trend in Russian social thought, A.N. Radishchev, 1749–1802, was an outstanding economist of his time. Radishchev, resolutely attacking serfdom and defending the oppressed peasantry, made an annihilating criticism of the serf-owning system, exposed the exploiting nature of the wealth of the landlords and serf owners, the owners of manufactories and traders, and justified the right to ownership of land of those who worked it with their labor. Radishchev was firmly convinced that the autocracy and serfdom could be liquidated only by revolutionary means. He worked out a system of economic measures which were progressive for his time, and the realization of which would have secured Russia's advance to a bourgeois democratic system. The Decembrists, in the first half of the 19th century, were revolutionaries of that historical period in Russia when the need to replace feudalism by capitalism had ripened. They directed the edge of their criticism against serfdom. Standing forth as fiery partisans of the development of Russia's productive forces, they considered the abolition of serfdom and the emancipation of the peasants as the most important conditions of this development. The Decembrists not only put forward the slogan of struggle against serfdom and autocracy, but also organized an armed rising against the absolute monarchy. P.I. Pastel, 1793–1826, worked out an original scheme for the solution of the agrarian problem in Russia. He drew up a kind of draft constitution, which he called the Russian law, envisaging the urgent and complete emancipation of the peasants from serfdom, and also economic measures for the defense of the peasants' interests for the future. For this purpose, Pastel considered it essential to create a special public land fund from which each peasant could receive for his own use, without payment, land essential for his existence. This fund should be formed out of part of the land of the landlords and the government. Moreover, part of the land should be alienated from the largest landlords without compensation. The Decembrists, as revolutionaries coming from the ranks of the gentry, were far from the people, but their ideas of struggle against serfdom helped the growth of the revolutionary movement in Russia. The ideology of the bourgeoisie in their rise to supremacy was formed in conditions of the breakdown of feudalism and the birth of the capitalist order of society. This ideology was directed against the feudal system and against religion as the ideological weapon of the feudal lords. Therefore, the outlook of the bourgeoisie struggling for power had a progressive character in a number of countries. Its most notable representatives, economists and philosophers, subjected to decisive criticism all the fundamental principles of feudal society: economic, political, religious, philosophical, and moral. They played a great part in the ideological preparation of the bourgeois revolution and exerted a progressive influence on the development of science and art. Brief conclusions. 1. Feudalism arose on the basis of the disintegration of slave-owning society and the breakup of the village community of the tribes which conquered the slave-owning states. In those countries where there had been no slave-owning system, feudalism arose on the basis of the breakup of the primitive community system. The clan aristocracy and military leaders of the tribes took into their hands a great quantity of lands and distributed them among their followers. The gradual enserfing of the peasants took place. 2. The feudal lord's ownership of land and incomplete ownership of the worker in production. The peasant serf was the basis of the relations of production in feudal society. As well as feudal property, there existed the individual property of the peasant and craftsman, which was based on personal labor. The labor of the peasant serfs was the source of the existence of feudal society. Serf exploitation was expressed in the fact that the peasants were compelled to perform weak work for the feudal lord, or to pay him quitrent in kind and in money. The burden that serfdom laid on the peasant was frequently little different from that of slavery. However, the serf system opened certain possibilities for the development of the productive forces, since the peasant could work a certain part of the time on his own holding and had a certain interest in his labor. 3. The basic economic law of feudalism consists in the production of surplus product to satisfy the demands of the feudal lords, by means of the exploitation of dependent peasants, on the basis of the ownership of the land by the feudal lords and their incomplete ownership of the workers in production, the serfs. For feudal society, particularly in the period of the early Middle Ages, was split into small princedoms and states. The nobility and clergy were the ruling estates of feudal society. The peasant estate had no political rights. A class struggle between peasants and feudal lords took place throughout the whole history of feudal society. The feudal state, reflecting the interests of nobility and clergy, was an active force helping them to consolidate their right of feudal ownership of the land and to intensify their exploitation of the dispossessed and oppressed peasants. 5. In the feudal epoch, agriculture played a predominant part, and the economy had a basically natural character. With the development of the social division of labor and exchange, the old towns which had survived the fall of the slave-owning system revived, and new towns arose. The towns were centers of handicraft and trade. The crafts were organized in guilds which strove to prevent competition. Traders united in merchant guilds. 6. The development of commodity production, breaking down the natural economy, led to differentiation among the peasants and the craftsmen. Merchant capital hastened the decline of the crafts and promoted the birth of capitalist enterprise, the manufactories. Feudal limitations and territorial divisions acted as a brake on the growth of commodity production. In the process of further development, the national market was formed. The centralized feudal state arose in the form of absolute monarchy. 7. Primitive accumulation of capital prepared the conditions for the rise of capitalism. Huge numbers of small producers, peasants, and craftsmen were deprived of the means of production. Great monetary wealth concentrated in the hands of large landowners, merchants, and usurers was created by means of the forcible expropriation of the peasantry, colonial trade, taxes, and the slave trade. Thus, the formation of the basic classes of capitalist society, of wage workers and capitalists, was accelerated. More or less complete forms of the capitalist order of society grew and ripened in the womb of feudal society. 8. The production relations of feudalism, the low productivity of the unfree labor of the peasant serfs, and guild restrictions, hindered the further development of productive forces. Peasant-serf risings shook the feudal system and led to the abolition of serfdom. The bourgeoisie took the lead in the struggle for the overthrow of feudalism. It made use of the revolutionary struggle of the peasants against the feudal lords in order to take power into its own hands. The bourgeois revolutions put an end to the feudal system and established the rule of capitalism, giving scope for the development of the forces of production.